3 days after they tore down my wind turbine, the president of the neighborhood association drove past my property with the biggest smile I'd ever seen on her face. The funny thing was, she thought she had one. What she didn't know was that by the time she celebrated her little victory, I had already signed paperwork that was about to change the entire future of that town. And when summer arrived, the people cheering her on would be the same people begging me for help. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 44 years old, an electrical systems engineer, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of guy nobody notices. I'm not the loudest person in the room. I don't enjoy arguments. I don't post my opinions online. Honestly, most weekends I prefer sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee and listening to the wind move through the trees. Maybe that's why I bought the land. About 7 years ago, before all the development started, I purchased a little over 6 acres outside of town called Brookhaven. Back then it was mostly open fields, old farms, and gravel roads. The kind of place where you could actually hear yourself think. What attracted me wasn't the scenery. It was the wind. Most people look at a piece of property and see a house site. I look at one and see infrastructure, wind patterns, solar exposure, drainage, grid access, occupational hazard, I guess. After a year of planning, permits, inspections, engineering reviews, and enough paperwork to fill a pickup truck, I installed a mid-sized residential wind turbine near the back of my property. Nothing crazy. It wasn't one of those giant commercial towers you see off the interstate. Just a clean, efficient system that powered my house, charged battery backups, and occasionally pushed excess electricity back in the grid. For almost 3 years, nobody cared. Then Brookhaven started growing. Developers showed up first. Then construction crews. Then came sidewalks, decorative streetlights, matching mailboxes, and eventually an upscale subdivision called Silver Creek Estates. And right behind Silver Creek came the organization that would eventually become my biggest headache, the Homeowners Association. Now, don't get me wrong. I've met perfectly reasonable HOA boards before. This wasn't one of them. The president was a woman named Victoria Langford, early 50s, always dressed like she was heading to a charity luncheon. Perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect smile. The kind of smile that somehow made you feel insulted even when she was being polite. The first time she visited my property, she stood at the fence line looking up at my turbine as if she'd discovered a dead raccoon in her swimming pool. "Mr. Mercer," she said, adjusting her sunglasses. "We've received several concerns from residents." I looked around. "About what?" She pointed. "The structure." I followed her finger. "My turbine." "Yes." I couldn't help laughing. She didn't. "It's becoming a visual issue for the community." She continued. "A visual issue. It negatively impacts the aesthetic standards we've worked very hard to establish." I remember taking a sip of coffee before answering. "That's unfortunate." Her smile tightened. "You don't seem concerned." "Well," I said, "that's probably because I don't live in Silver Creek Estates." For a second, neither of us spoke, because we both knew the truth. My property wasn't part of their development. It never had been. Different zoning, different boundaries, different legal authority. Victoria knew it. I knew it. But some people have a hard time accepting that there are places their power doesn't reach. As she walked back toward her SUV, she paused beside the driver's door. "We'll be reviewing our options." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. Not because I was afraid, because I knew exactly what kind of person she was. And deep down, I had a feeling that conversation wasn't the beginning of a disagreement. It was the beginning of a war. Victoria didn't waste any time. About a week after that conversation, I found the first letter sitting in my mailbox. Official-looking envelope. Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association printed across the top. Inside was a complaint regarding excessive noise. I actually laughed out loud when I read it. My turbine generated less noise than most residential air conditioning units. I knew it because I designed part of the sound mitigation system myself. I tossed the letter into a drawer and forgot about it. Then another arrived. This one claimed the turbine presented a safety hazard. A week later came another. Visual pollution, property value concerns, wildlife disruption, potential zoning violations. The accusations kept changing because none of them were real. What stayed consistent was the sender, Victoria. At first it was annoying, then it became entertaining. Every Friday afternoon, I'd open the mailbox wondering what new creative complaint she'd invented. My friend Caleb stopped by one evening while I was grilling burgers. He picked up one of the letters from the patio table, and started reading. You gotta be kidding me. Nope. Possible emotional distress caused by industrial appearance. I nodded. That one's one of my favorites. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped his beer. But underneath the humor, something else was happening. Victoria wasn't trying to win an argument. She was creating a paper trail, building a narrative, making it look like a problem existed even though it didn't. And eventually the letters turned into fines. $200, $500, $1,000. Every notice claimed I was violating rules that legally had nothing to do with my property. Most people would have called, argued, appealed, tried to defend themselves. I did none of those things, because the moment you start responding, you legitimize the game. You acknowledge authority that doesn't exist. So I ignored everything. That drove Victoria absolutely crazy. I could tell. Every few weeks, she'd appear somewhere near my property. Sometimes parked across the road. Sometimes walking with board members. Always looking at the turbine. Always watching. Like she was waiting for me to break. The funny thing was, while she was obsessing over my turbine, I was focused on something much bigger. For nearly 6 months, I'd been having quiet conversations with a regional energy company called Horizon Utility Partners. The town was growing faster than anyone expected. New neighborhoods, new shopping centers, new apartment complexes. Electricity demand was climbing through the roof. Most residents never think about where power comes from until it disappears. People assume electricity just exists. Trust me, it doesn't. Every growing community eventually runs into infrastructure limits. And Brookhaven was approaching theirs. Fast. The engineers at Horizon knew it. I knew it. What nobody else realized was that my property sat in a nearly perfect location for a future distribution project. The discussions were still confidential. Nothing had been announced. No contracts were public. No permits had been filed. But things were moving. Slowly. Carefully. Meanwhile, Victoria was still fixated on a wind turbine. Then came the day everything changed. I remember it perfectly. It was a Thursday, late afternoon. Hot enough that the steering will burn my hand when I climbed out of my truck. I'd spent the entire day at a transmission facility about 2 counties away. I was exhausted, hungry, ready to shower and call a night. The moment I turned into my driveway, something felt wrong. You ever walk into your house and immediately know something's off? That's what it felt like. I couldn't explain it. I just knew. I parked, stepped out, looked toward the back of the property, and froze. The turbine was gone. Not damaged, not leaning, not broken. Gone. Completely gone. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The tower had stood there for years. Every day, every morning, every sunset. Then suddenly there was nothing. Just empty sky. I walked across the property as fast as I could. The closer I got, the worse it looked. Tire tracks, fresh dirt, equipment marks, a few bolts scattered across the ground. That was it. $80,000 worth of equipment had vanished. I stood there staring at the empty foundation. Not angry. Not yet. Just confused. A neighbor named Ron wandered over from across the road. You okay? I looked at him. What happened? He scratched the back of his neck. Contractors showed up around 7 this morning. Contractors? Yeah. Couple trucks. Crane. Crew. I felt my stomach tighten. What did they say? Said they were removing a zoning violation. I laughed once, short and sharp, because the answer was so ridiculous. They had paperwork, Ron added. Of course they did. There's always paperwork. People will believe almost anything if it's printed on official-looking letterhead. The first call I made was to the county planning office. No violation. No removal order. No permit. Nothing. The second call was to the sheriff's department. A deputy came out, walked around, took notes, looked at the foundation, then gave me the answer I already expected. Sounds like a civil matter. Civil matter. Those 2 words are basically the government's way of saying you're about to spend a lot of money. I call my attorney next. After reviewing everything, he sighed. Ethan, you've got a strong case. I know. This was illegal. I know. But litigation could take years. There it was. The reality. I was right. And it didn't matter. Not immediately. Because the turbine was still gone. The damage was already done. As the sun started setting, I sat on the porch staring at the empty horizon. Then I heard tires crunching on gravel. A white SUV rolled slowly past the property. Victoria's SUV. She didn't stop, didn't wave, didn't say a word. She simply looked over at the empty foundation and smiled. just for a second. But it was enough. She thought she'd won. What she didn't know was that less than 48 hours earlier, I had signed the final agreement with Horizon Utility Partners. And buried inside that agreement was something that would soon make my missing turbine the least important thing happening in Brookhaven. Because while Victoria was celebrating the destruction of one piece of infrastructure, I was about to become part of something much, much bigger. The first construction trucks arrived 3 weeks later. Most people in Brookhaven had no idea what was happening. They'd drive past and see fencing going up, survey markers, utility crews, concrete foundations, and enough heavy equipment to make it obvious that somebody was spending serious money. Questions started spreading through town. Nobody seemed to have answers. I did. I just wasn't sharing them. One afternoon, I was standing near the property line when I noticed a familiar white SUV slowing down on the road. Victoria. Again, she parked for a moment and stared through the fence. I could practically see the confusion on her face. The turbine she'd spent months trying to destroy was gone. Yet somehow the property looked busier than ever, more important than ever. She never got out, never asked questions. She just drove away. And honestly, that ended up being one of the biggest mistakes she ever made. Because if she had stopped, if she had simply asked what was being built, she might have realized how badly she'd miscalculated. By early summer, the new Horizon distribution facility was operational. Not massive, not flashy, but incredibly important. The facility strengthened load balancing across several rapidly growing sections of the county. It was exactly the kind of infrastructure nobody notices until they desperately need it. And then summer arrived. Not a normal summer. The kind that feels personal. Day after day, temperatures climbed higher. 98, 102, 106, then 110. Air conditioners ran nonstop. Transformers overheated. Demand exploded across the region. Inside the utility industry, we'd been expecting stress. What we didn't expect was just how quickly things would escalate. The first outages were minor. A neighborhood here, a commercial block there. Nothing unusual. Then the blackouts started spreading. Longer interruptions. More customers affected. More pressure on the system. Every day became a balancing act. Keep one area online. Protect another. Shift load. Prevent larger failures. The grid was under siege. Then something interesting started happening. Silver Creek Estates kept getting hit harder than surrounding neighborhoods. Not permanently, not intentionally, just consistently. Whenever restoration priorities were being evaluated, areas with stronger infrastructure support tended to recover faster. Areas with weaker redundancy waited longer. Silver Creek found itself on the wrong side of those calculations again and again. At first, residents blamed the utility company. Then they blamed the weather. Then they started blaming the HOA. The community meetings became legendary. People yelling. Residents demanding answers. Parents furious about spoiled groceries. Retirees complaining about sleeping in 90-degree bedrooms. Business owners threatening legal action. And through all of it, Victoria had absolutely no control. That's the thing about infrastructure. It doesn't care about popularity. It doesn't care about authority. It doesn't care who chairs a board meeting. Physics always wins. About a month into the worst heat wave, my phone rang. Unknown number. I looked at the screen for a second, then answered. Ethan Mercer. Silence. A long silence. Then I heard her voice. For the first time ever, Victoria sounded tired. Not confident. Not polished. Tired. Ethan, this is Victoria Langford. I figured. Another pause. The kind people make when they're swallowing their pride. I understand you've become involved with a new distribution facility. I have. We've been experiencing severe service interruptions. I looked through the window toward the distant utility structures. Yes, our residents are suffering. I didn't answer. She continued. Elderly homeowners. Families with children. People are frustrated. Still, I said nothing. Then she finally asked the question she never imagined she'd have to ask. What can we do? Now what can you do? What can we do? That one word told me everything. Because for the first time, she wasn't speaking from a position of authority. She was speaking from a position of need. I leaned back in my chair. For a few seconds, all I heard was the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Then I said something she probably remembers to this day. You destroyed the only local energy project that was actually helping your neighborhood. The silence afterward lasted so long I thought the call had disconnected. Eventually she spoke. I realized mistakes may have been made. I almost laughed. Even then she couldn't fully admit it. But I wasn't interested in revenge. Not really. Revenge is emotional. This was business. So I gave her terms. Full reimbursement for the turbine based on replacement value. Immediate withdrawal of every HOA fine and violation notice. A legally recorded acknowledgement that my property and future projects existed completely outside HOA authority. And finally, a public correction. Not for me, for the residents. Because they deserve to know they'd been fed misinformation for nearly 2 years. Victoria didn't answer immediately. She said she'd discuss it with the board. 2 days later, another major outage hit Silver Creek. 3 days after that, she called back. We accept. Funny how quickly negotiations move when people stop pretending they have leverage. The paperwork was completed within weeks. The fines vanished. The acknowledgement was recorded. The reimbursement arrived. And at a packed community meeting, Victoria stood before hundreds of residents and publicly corrected the record. No dramatic shouting. No humiliation. Just facts. The truth has a way of doing enough damage on its own. A few months later, a new turbine rose over my property. Bigger, quieter, more efficient. As it turned slowly against the evening sky, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun disappear behind the hills. The new distribution facility hummed quietly in the distance. The turbine turned steadily above the trees. And for the first time in a long while, everything felt balanced. Now here's the part people always argue about whenever I tell this story. Some folks say I should have sued immediately. Others think I should have gone public and destroyed the HOA from day one. And a few people think I was too patient. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong. The truth is, I never wanted to fight. I just refused to surrender. There's a difference. Because this story was never really about a turbine. It wasn't even about Victoria. It was about understanding where real power comes from. Some people think power comes from titles. Others think it comes from rules. But after everything that happened, I've come to believe power comes from understanding the system better than the people trying to control it. And that's exactly why I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have gone straight to court the moment the turbine disappeared? Would you have fought publicly and exposed the HOA immediately? Or would you have stayed quiet, played the long game, and waited for the right moment to act? Let me know in the comments. Because honestly, even after all these years, I'm still not sure everyone would agree on who was right.